Hello and welcome. This is Alan Yarborough from the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations, and we're happy you could join us for our Global Vaccine Access webinar today. Just a quick note on housekeeping before we begin. All audience lines are muted, and we are recording today's webinar so that we can make it available online and in a follow-up email. For questions, please submit questions for any of the panelists using the Q&A box. We will respond to these questions during the designated Q&A time. For folks joining on Facebook, you may also comment in the comment section of the Facebook Live video, and we will also monitor that for questions. Please be welcoming, considerate, and patient in your comments and your questions. We are all at different places in this work, and everyone has something to offer and learn. At this point, I will turn it over to Canon Chuck Robertson to continue with the webinar.
Welcome. It is wonderful to have you with us. I'm Chuck Robertson, the Canon to the Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church for Ministry Beyond. And I am delighted with the Office of Government Relations to present a distinguished group of panelists as we talk about something that we've been talking about for a long time now. It seems like we've been talking about it for a lifetime. And most of us can still remember as we begin to do new things that we have not done in a long time, we'll say, oh, I remember when I used to do that, because this time of COVID has changed all of us. Now we're in a phase in which we are looking at some light at the end of the tunnel. But for some, it may feel like the light is still a bit of a ways to go. And now we have questions as we come to vaccinations. We have questions of everything from vaccination equity to issues of pure distribution to issues as in the past 48 hours of what happens when we see one paused or recalled. So there's a lot to talk about, to continue to talk about. And we in the faith communities, we here in the Anglican Communion have much to share with one another and much to learn still. So before I introduce our panelists, let me just say a little something about terminology. What we're talking about in all of this, of course, has been trying to find protection from the virus known as SARS-CoV-2. It is the virus that causes the disease COVID-19. As we know that in the just even a year ago, we were still trying to understand the early days of this, trying to figure out what this meant, trying to figure out where this would go, and probably had little conception a year ago that we would still be talking about this now. It has been a devastating time, a devastating year. We went from 6 degrees of separation from folks who had it to now I would dare say every one of us has known someone close to us who has had it. And many of us have indeed lost dear ones to this. Now we have vaccines out. And let me say a little something. When we're talking about the vaccines, what are we talking about? Again, talking about products that stimulate a person's immune system to produce immunity to a specific disease, thus protecting that person from the disease. Now, vaccines, of course, we have seen the miracle of vaccines in the past. We think about polio and how it literally was game-changing to see vaccines come out. But there sure has been a lot of talk and questions and wondering about the vaccination process that we find ourselves in. And it is to that we will be turning to our distinguished panelists today. Now, let me say a little about these good folks. We are absolutely honored and delighted to have with us the Most Reverend Dr. Thabo Makgoba, who is Archbishop of Cape Town and Primate of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa since 2007. He earned a PhD from the University of Cape Town in 2009 and is the recipient of several honorary doctorates as well as the Cross of St. Augustine. Archbishop Thabo is a respected leader in the Anglican Communion and has recently chaired both the Lambeth Conference Planning Team and the Anglican Communion Office Review Team. He's well known for his advocacy on issues of climate change and creation care, and has in recent times spoken out on the issue of vaccination equitability. He's also a dear friend to our church and to many of us personally. Archbishop Thabo, it is wonderful to have you with us. The Most Reverend Dr. Linder Nicholls is Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada since her installation in July 2019. And I was there and will tell you it was a most wonderful celebration. She previously served as Bishop of Huron and before that as Area Bishop of Trent Durham in the Diocese of Toronto. She has earned a Doctor of Ministry degree from the University of Toronto in 2002, as well as degrees in music and education, and has a special love of and I would say gift for spirituality and helping teach and bring that out. Archbishop Linder has served as co-chair of the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue in Canada and has been a member of ARCIC 3, the Third Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, and again is a dear friend to many of us here in our church, in the Episcopal Church. Archbishop Linder, wonderful to see you. The Right Reverend Dr. Michael Beasley is Bishop of Hertford in the Diocese of St. Albans since 2015, having previously served as Director of Mission for the Diocese of Oxford, and before that as Vice Principal of Westcott House, Cambridge. Indeed, I think you did a little of everything at Westcott House at one point or another. He studied theology, and I have to say this, he studied theology at Cranmer Hall, St. John's College in Durham in the late 1990s, where I had the pleasure of getting to know him during my time there as a doctoral student and a consultant for the Church of England. Bishop Michael decided it's not enough to be a bishop in the Church of England, so he also happens to be an epidemiologist, having earned a Bachelor of Science degree at Imperial College London and later a DPhil degree from Oriel College, Oxford in 1996. We are delighted to have you, good bishop and doctor, to be with us in this time. And finally, our panel is completed with my own dear colleague, Rebecca Linder Blachly, who is director of the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations since 2016, representing the public policy positions adopted by General Convention and Executive Council, as well as representing the ministry of the presiding bishop to policymakers in Washington, D.C. Rebecca holds a Master of Divinity degree from Harvard University and previously served as Senior Policy Advisor for Africa in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs in the U.S. Department of State. And before that, she served in the U.S. Department of Defense, where she was awarded the Medal for Exceptional Public Service in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I've often told people that what I lack in wisdom, I make up for in finding incredible people to hire. And it has been an honor and privilege to first have hired and now to have as my colleague in ministry, Rebecca. So Rebecca, thank you. And thank you and the Office of Government Relations, especially Alan Yarborough, who's behind the scenes in this time in promoting this good work today. So now, having gotten to know a little bit about who you all are, let's hear what you have to say. So I'm going to start by asking kind of a framing question for all of you. What are the challenges to global vaccine access? From where you're sitting, what do you see as those challenges? And how can our religious communities help vaccine distribution to be equitable? And let's start with you, Archbishop Thabo.
Thank you so much, Chuck, and thank you to my fellow panelists. From where I sit in South Africa, which in the rest of the continent is well endowed in terms of medical provision, medical policies, and access to health, we have almost 1.5 million people that are positive. We have around 53,000 fatalities. And to date, we are thinking about accessing vaccines one day. Only 260,000 medical professionals have been vaccinated. So as you can see, if South Africa in the continent is still dreaming about vaccination of its citizens, you can imagine Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland. So the situation is not looking great. And South Africa raised its hand when some trials were done, and perhaps we were naive as a country, thinking that if we did that, when the vaccines became available, we will get good prices or we will be considered. And now the patent laws, the licensing, and the hoarding is hitting us hard. So we're spending a lot of time advocating for access, advocating for what we saw at the beginning of this pandemic, for solidarity. And in biblical terms, we say, maybe to borrow from John 10:10, we're saying he came so that we may have life and have it abundantly, not so that some may have it and have it abundantly. And we're feeling like on our road to Emmaus, after that tragic death, we are walking alone. And so that is why this webinar is very important. So it's for the first time that I'm starting to walk with some of my colleagues within the communion. Let me stop there, Chuck.
Yeah, I think we'll have much more to say about that. I later want to come back to the question of the patents that you were talking about. Really appreciate that. And yes, we are talking about life abundance, and yet that is not the reality yet for a lot of parts of the communion and the globe. Archbishop Linder, could you help us think about this from where you're sitting there as the Archbishop and Primate of Canada?
Well, certainly vaccine distribution and equity in Canada has been challenging. In the early days of distribution, the sources for Canada were delayed by production in Europe, with shutdowns in Europe. And when it did arrive, sharing it across vast geography and remote and isolated communities has been challenging, especially for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that require such careful handling. However, the Canadian government has worked hard to ensure that when it began to arrive, the most vulnerable, elderly, frontline healthcare workers, and Indigenous people were the first to receive them. It is especially critical in Canada for Indigenous people as they are more susceptible to COVID. An outbreak in a northern Indigenous reserve is devastating due to overcrowding of families due to lack of housing, challenges around clean water supplies, and the lack of local medical facilities or personnel, especially when communities just completely locked down and would not have anybody in or out in an attempt to protect themselves. We also face political and economic challenges as the governments of different internal provinces have differing public health approaches that are confusing and frustrating. We are currently seeing rebellions amongst those who will not comply with the restrictions, lockdowns, curfews, and protocols, and that is quite concerning. However, the vaccine rollout is ramping up, and most willing Canadians will be vaccinated by the end of September. And we're deeply grateful to the United States for having made a loan of vaccine to Mexico and Canada in advance so that some of that could proceed. But we do have a challenge with vaccine hesitancy amongst those who, some people, given the facts that the vaccine trials are continuing and revealing new information that is worrisome to some, although the efficacy and in fact the rarity of severe complications is actually quite remarkable. Global vaccine equity is on the minds of many in Canada as we know that the virus knows no borders. Even as we also within the Christian community hold up the primary value of our call to love our neighbor as ourselves. In Canada, the Primate's World Relief and Development Fund is committed to working with partners on the ground towards COVID relief. Although they're not delivering vaccine directly, they are supporting partners in preventive health, purchase of PPE, maternal and child health, and COVID education efforts, especially in 2 refugee camps in Kenya, as well as at home in Canada amongst vulnerable populations. More recently, a nonprofit children's organization, Millennium Kids, has teamed up with UNICEF Canada to propose an interfaith project called Love My Neighbor that is launching today. There was an open invitation to any faith community to join, And in the space of about 2 months, a remarkable gathering of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities are working with UNICEF to deliver the COVAX vaccines in needed areas of the world, using the idea that if you've been given a vaccine, pay it forward. Pay it at least to pay for one other person in another part of the world. Some partners in this project, like the Anglican Church of Canada, are committed to awareness and advocacy with our own governments to contribute to COVAX, to ensure equitable distribution. And so we're working with ecumenical partners to lobby our government leaders, or at least to be their conscience on issues of global significance that require the have nations to share more. Our advocacy will include redistribution of excess vaccine, the waiving of TRIPS agreements for vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, increased Canadian financial support for health systems focused on equipping local community health organizations, especially women-led organizations. Interestingly, the church leaders were invited by the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to a meeting online a few months ago to invite our help as trusted leaders in our communities. And in the Canadian context, this is highly unusual, as we are a very secularized nation in so many ways. We are seeing now how our voices as partners for the common good are still essential and powerful. And I know that may be more common in other parts of the world, but it is a welcome renewal here in Canada. And our clergy and bishops are using every opportunity to promote vaccinations, selfies when they're having their own vaccinations, and regular encouragement. We're very aware that in Canada we have a strongly supportive government, good health care available, and resources to ensure we will be vaccinated. In fact, my own is this afternoon. Now we must engage in ensuring that others have the same. As Christians, it is no less than a mandate of our baptism, seeking justice and peace for all people, respecting the dignity of every human being, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. Thank you.
Amen to that. And we're going to come back to a few things you mentioned, and already we have some wonderful questions coming in. Again, I want to remind folks of what you heard at the start, that you are welcome and encouraged to send us questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the webinar. Don't use the chat for that. Please use the Q&A, and we'll go to that and find. And already we have some that we're going to be addressing later on, including questions about how to help in what you were saying in helping folks get vaccinated. So we'll come back to that. I'll just note also, Archbishop Linder, that in our own context in the United States part of the Episcopal Church, that the White House has asked, and we have said yes, and joined what is known as a COVID community core, groups of religious leaders working, and even last night had a meeting, a half-hour meeting last night that I'll allude to later as well. But before we get to those other questions, other comments, let me turn to Bishop Michael and hear some things from you again about this framing question. From where you sit, what are you seeing as we look at the challenges before us?
Thank you so much, Chuck. It's wonderful to be with you and with everybody else today. You asked, what are the challenges to global vaccine access? And for me, I think the answer to that question is the biggest challenges that we face are challenges of understanding and imagination. I just don't think we've got our heads around it as a world yet, that we have to ensure that every adult across the planet gets access to vaccination. That's what we need to happen. I'm speaking from the United Kingdom, where we've been exceptionally blessed at the rollout of the vaccine here. Approximately 60% of adults in the United Kingdom have now been vaccinated. But what we're discovering here in Britain is that that's not enough. It's still not enough for our economy fully to open, for livelihoods fully to be resumed, for human flourishing, the human flourishing about which Archbishop Thabo spoke about, to really get underway again, if it was complete before. And therefore, I think that our biggest challenge is one of imagination, of saying that it's vital for us all across the world that everybody gets access. We know that we've heard from the World Health Organization that none of us are safe and protected until we're all safe and protected. Because while that's the case, new variants will arrive. And even where populations have been vaccinated, such as they have been in Britain, then we'll be vulnerable to different variants springing up in different parts of the world. So I think our biggest challenge is of saying, how can we have a big enough imagination to say that seeing vaccination for everybody is not something we'd like to have or would be preferable or possible? It's vital. And we have to get behind thinking like that. Thinking about how we work creatively with national governments, with pharmaceutical companies, and with the multilateral agencies like the WHO and UNICEF, to really get behind making use of all the world's capacity to see a sufficient production of vaccine so that everybody can access it. It's a difficult field to work in. We know that producing vaccines, if you're producing pharmaceuticals, that's maybe like cookery normally. I think producing vaccines is more like Michelin star cookery. So how do we get enough capacity to get enough vaccine for everybody? How do we get enough, and how do we make sure that there's enough ongoing development so that when new variants arise, the vaccines can be updated quickly and effectively so that they work everywhere? There are big questions, I believe, too, about vaccine delivery. I understand that UNICEF, who are really taking the lead on this, have said that producing the vaccine is like getting to base camp on Everest. But to get to the peak of the mountain, you've got to work out how to deliver the vaccines. And that's another challenge for us. And then, of course, there's the issue of take-up, where as faith communities, we can have such an important contribution to make in terms of assuring people of the safety and benefit of taking up vaccinations. And it was great to hear from Archbishop Linder about the work that's been going on in Canada there. And we've been doing very similar stuff here in Britain, of faith groups working with hard to reach populations to ensure that vaccine gets taken up. It was lovely to hear from Archbishop Linder about the program with the churches that you mentioned. We've been doing something similar here in the Church of England, working with other Christian denominations and with our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters. We've pinched language from across the pond, and our program with UNICEF is called Give the World a Shot. So I think all those things are necessary. And it's the imagination and understanding too, to see that until this is done, the life of the world is going to be on hold. It's terrifying to think that over the last year, 250 million children in Africa have been out of school because schools have been shut down due to the pandemic. In Ghana, schools were shut for 10 months. And many children, particularly girls, are unlikely to come back. Healthcare, the WHO report that take up of usual healthcare, such as inpatient admissions or take up of childhood vaccinations, has dropped by more than 50% in Africa. Africa is going to potentially see its first recession for 25 years, and 40 million people are likely to be pushed into extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic. So we need a big imagination to come up with big solutions for this big problem.
Yes, indeed. Until this is dealt with, the life of the world is on hold. Boy, truer words have not been spoken. Thank you for that, Bishop Beasley. We're going to want to come back to you and ask some more questions too that come out of that. But first, let me speak with Rebecca. Rebecca is here in the U.S. part of the Episcopal Church. as you are there in the heart of where policymaking is done, what do you see as some of the challenges before us?
Thank you. And thank you so much to the previous panelists for laying out the issues so clearly and sharing some more information about the contexts you're in and the challenges you're facing. So we really are in an incredible position that we have so many approved and effective vaccines. I think that's something worth celebrating and noting, that there's been really an incredible effort that went underway for us to be in this position. And I think that underscores the point even more that we shouldn't squander this opportunity. Given everything that's happened with the vaccine, we have an opportunity to vaccinate the world in a way that we haven't had before. So I'll speak to some of the policy challenges that I see, and then hopefully later we'll talk about some of the opportunities also. But first, I think on the policy side, there's a question of funding. There's been massive support from taxpayers in countries around the world for the development of the vaccine. So billions of dollars have been spent. And again, as a result, we have numerous authorized vaccines. The US alone invested $12 billion in Operation Warp Speed for vaccine development. The investment needs to continue, however. We need investments not only for COVAX, which would allow for some level of global vaccine distribution, but also on the procurement piece. That is also related to funding. And I think it's a challenge. COVAX was an effort to try to avoid each nation needing to make bilateral deals, and instead to make sure that especially low-income countries had the opportunity and some guaranteed vaccine access. And so the US and others have invested money in COVAX rather than doses, but there's also the question of vaccine doses. There's a movement to have procurement contracts be made public so that countries can see and evaluate how much they're paying, and for that to be able to help there be more transparency and wider access and equity. There's also the challenge, as has been indicated already, of production. So that's the question of factories and production facilities that are not evenly distributed all over the globe. There's a somewhat limited number of production facilities right now, and that could be expanded, but it would take an investment and also some time. And there's also the question of the intellectual property. So this is the World Trade Organization's trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, known as the TRIPS agreement. And the TRIPS waiver would mean that the rules relating to intellectual property, which mean that other countries or other companies wouldn't be able to produce the vaccine, would be waived, so that the vaccine could, intellectual property and trade secrets could be shared more widely. So there's a big effort in the advocacy community for there to be a TRIPS waiver. India and South Africa initiated this proposal to the World Trade Organization in October. And now more than 100 developing countries have joined that, but the US, UK, EU, and I believe Canada have opposed that. So I think that's another piece of it, along with, in the US context, the Defense Production Act, which allows manufacturing capabilities to be put towards vaccine production in various aspects, but that also means that other things are not made. And there's some question about whether that will impact the global supply chain, which is a critical piece of this too, the vaccine, but then also all the other pieces that need to be in place, like glass vials and reagents and the right kind of plastic bags. All of that are pieces of making sure that this effort is able to succeed. And the distribution, I think, is a challenge as well, with the refrigeration and, again, transportation, expiration dates of vaccines, scheduling, the 2-dose component. I mean, I think that that's another piece, the logistical component, that will need to be ready for global effort and coordination to address. And then, as also indicated, I think there's questions of vaccine hesitancy challenges. In the US, certainly in many of the most vulnerable communities, we've seen this as a problem and need to, as a faith community in particular, come together to do all we can to address that. And then I think there's also associated challenges that some medical production facilities have stopped producing thyroid medicine and cancer drugs in order to produce the COVID-19 vaccines. So there's question of whether there will be some shortages of other medicines. And of course, also there's been a devastating economic impact mental health challenges associated with this. So I think as we're looking at the response and with equity, we also need to look at public and global health more generally, and of course, many other factors as well.
Boy, there is so much for us to address here and to learn from. Even as I think about some of the work that is being done by places as diverse as Chatham House in London, or the Brookings Institute, or Council on Foreign Relations, there's so many wonderful reports. I, in fact, am going to be sharing in the chat room for all attendees a report that has come out from the Council on Foreign Relations Independent Task Force report on preparedness, pandemic preparedness, and the lessons we have learned from this COVID-19 already. And there are many others, and would welcome others putting in other reports they may know. There's much we can learn, but also much to do. Going back to the issue of vaccine hesitancy, last night heard from Dr. Anthony Fauci, who may not be a name as familiar to some of our panels, but certainly, oh, good, thank you, bishops. Oh, good, glad to see that, that you do know that name. Certainly has become a household name in the United States. Along with the U.S. Surgeon General, was speaking about the recent issues of the pause. They said they're not quite calling it a recall, but the pause with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And one of the concerns that was coming out of that, it was dealing with six recorded cases of severe side effects out of over 6 million people who have received it thus far. And one of the concerns that was raised was the concern of whether that will help increase vaccine hesitancy among those who are already nervous. Was it a good idea to pause? And the answer that Dr. Fauci gave was very interesting in saying, no, this shows that the system is working. Said this shows that if we are showing an abundance of caution, maybe even an overabundance of caution, then people really will be able to trust us when we say the vaccines are good to use and we need for you to use them. Comments on that from any of you? What do you think of that notion and responding to those who do have, for all kinds of reasons, hesitancy towards vaccine?
I hear Dr. Fauci, and I hear that is a well-reasoned, well-thought-out, practical approach, but it doesn't take into account the emotional fear-based response. I stood in a pharmacy the other day behind a woman waiting for a long time who was interrogating the pharmacist about the vaccine and which one she should receive, and insisting on absolute guarantees. And the pharmacist was very carefully trying to explain that he can't give that. I mean, she needs to talk to her physician. And she said, well, I have, but he's not giving me enough. And it was clearly not a response, a thinking response. It was an emotional response. And I think that's the difficulty, is that people are responding out of fear and out of a desire for certainty that something in the middle of this incredible upheaval in their lives can be controlled. And so, although I agree with Dr. Fauci that it's showing transparency, it's showing caution, it's showing care, I'm not sure that people on the ground are going to hear it like that.
Indeed, fear. I think about what you said earlier, Archbishop Thabo, about when you quoted John 10:10, life abundantly. Let me quote from one of the letters of John in saying that perfect love casts out fear. How can we help combat the fear as faith communities? How can we help combat the fears that in some cases are very real, whether we think they're always valid or not? Some are, some aren't, it doesn't matter. They are real, those fears. How do we combat that as faith communities? I open that up. Archbishop Thabo, you look like you wanted to respond.
Yes, thank you very much, Chad. I think I'll just say education, education, education. We, at least in this continent, know that people have been vaccinated for BCG, for polio, People are still dealing with TB. They get vaccinated for TB. Malaria, which is really a scandal that in greater parts of the world it has been cleared. People still die of meningitis related to malaria, but they take their jab, they take their tablets. And so I think vaccine hesitancy so far for the bulk of us will be a choice of those that do have vaccines. When you don't have the vaccines, you don't know, and you don't have that choice. And perhaps as the Anglican Communion, as a faith group, as the Christian community, what we may need to do is, yes, hear Dr. Fauci, but raise different sets of questions around hesitancy or not. So place hesitancy within the context of those that have. And maybe go back to what Archbishop Linder said earlier on, and it was also mentioned that can we perhaps have the countries within the Anglican Communion in the global north and in the west really supporting countries like South Africa who are really calling for TRIPS waiver, so that there is some degree of anxiety as the whole family. Because if one family member is worried about the crumbs that fall from the table that are too small, and another family member is really eating loaves and loaves of bread. So we are addressing really different contextual issues. And if one family member is receiving the vaccine and another is being told to wait and be encouraged to pursue non-pharmaceutical interventions. So the questions are different, and maybe hesitancy can be dealt with education. I think it was Linda and also Michael did touch it on the importance of really educating people. But as we educate, we also need to advocate that all of us should get the bread and not the crumbs.
Amen to that. Dr. Michael and Bishop Michael, both. Let me ask you. One of our attendees was asking about. We heard a little bit from Archbishop Linda about how the indigenous communities, the question of vaccinations for the indigenous communities. What about for minority ethnic groups within Britain? What are you seeing happen right now, and how is that moving forward? And how is the church a part of helping in that?
This has been a major concern here in the United Kingdom for a number of our minority ethnic communities. There are, I think, long-term issues of how members of communities feel that they have been cared for or looked after by institutions of the state, and a sense that's not always been as good as it could have been, and that there is a suspicion and concern on the part of some around long-term issues of equity, of access and treatment and possibility. What we've sought to do here in the United Kingdom is very much to go down the route of trying our absolute best to lead by example. So a really important part of the work that we've been doing as churches has been liaison with our National Health Service to ensure that vaccination centres, for example, are occurring in as many different buildings as possible. So we have vaccinations going on in cathedrals, we have them going on in mosques, we have them going on in gurdwaras, and it's been really important to liaise well with leaders of UK minority ethnic churches that are churches which primarily have membership from UK minority ethnic people of that background, And that's been a really positive part of what we've been doing. There's also been the leadership shown by faith leaders of different faiths and denominations to be there, showing themselves being vaccinated and saying, this is safe, I encourage you to do this, this is a good thing to do. So I think that's been really important. I love the story, Archbishop Linder, of your pharmacist, who was doing really the right thing, even if it took a very long time. I think our discovery is that listening is really, really important when there's hesitancy or concern that folk, we've had a whole year of having fear ramped up like mad to control this infection. It's not going to go away quickly. And there's a huge, I've been engaged with one of my parishes today, which is, has not opened for public worship because they're still concerned about the safety of doing that. There's no point me saying, you have to open up, get on with it. There needs to be a really careful listening and an understanding of the concerns and fears that people have, because I think that's the only way that we'll move forward.
Before we step off to another question to the rest of the panelists, let me ask you one more question. One of our attendees was asking about a rumor that I had not heard. This is a new one to me. And again, in this day and time, what we're finding is rumors are rampant. That those vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine are more likely to get the South African variation of COVID-19. Have you heard that one at all? That is a new one, and Archbishop Thabo is smiling at that. I if anything, I'd love to hear from each of you on that.
I don't think it would be correct to say more likely to get the South African variant. I think there are questions around the different vaccines of their efficacy against the South African variant, but I'm not aware of really clear data about any of the vaccines as to which is the most effective against the new variants that are arising.
And Archbishop Thabo, I've got to ask you the same question. You immediately smiled when I said this.
I'm smiling because as a South African, maybe Rebecca may hear more of these through her office. When the other variants came from the UK, from Canada, or wherever they came, there were new variants. And when they came from South Africa, which is a different variant, now they are stuck with us, and they are South African variant. And now the variant has ensured that we are prohibited from traveling to England, to Michael, because of the South African variant. And I want to really appeal from where I sit to say, it is a variant, and let's put it into the pot of how do we look at what constitutes that variant, and the global scientific community and us can help find an appropriate vaccine for that. But I haven't heard that particular rumor, Chuck. That's why I'm just chuckling.
Neither did I.
Agree that there are all sorts of stories. Our Chief Justice here created havoc in the country when he prayed and said, if the vaccines have got the 666, the mark of the beast, I denounce them in the name of Christ. Now, this is the Chief Justice, and he said, if. A lot of people didn't hear if. And they said the Chief Justice says all vaccines have got the mark of the beast. And now that really set us backwards. But fortunately, the religious community is there to counter some of those interesting things. So, Chuck, it doesn't bode well for South Africa, because if we've got any other variant associated with us, they'll say South Africa too, and then we will forever be banned from going anywhere.
Oh my goodness, how true and how incredibly unjust. And so much of what we're talking about in this call is about justice around how we proceed from here. I can't help but think about the issue. You had earlier raised it, the issue of the patent issue. And I would just like to have us speak a little bit about the issue of vaccine nationalism. In fact, Rebecca, maybe you could start us off on this, but the whole question of vaccine nationalism that we have really seen come up, where does that take us as we move forward?
Yeah, thank you. And I would just add to the earlier point too. I think that the variant question it's worth noting that I think that highlights for us the importance and need for us to know that we're in this for the long haul as the international community. So the vaccines are remarkably effective, and we don't know all the answers about variants, but we should get everyone the vaccines that we have now. And then from there, I think that the right move would be to have the pharmaceutical companies and again, public investment work on boosters so that we can have the follow-up and make sure that we have that. But I would just say for now, the issue is, getting the vaccines out as much as possible, but then knowing this isn't just probably a one and done kind of thing, but that there may well be, again, depending on how long it takes to vaccinate the world's population, ongoing effort required. I would say on the vaccine nationalism point, I mean, the positive piece of it is that there were major investments from a number of countries early on. And I think that came from a place of vaccine nationalism, again, of kind of taxpayer money going in to put the money into research and kind of de-risking for the pharmaceutical companies to be able to pre-purchase vaccines prior to their efficacy and trial data being released, knowing that they were effective. But at this point, it's a time to transition away from away from there being a concern about just national interests and really to transform and realize that not only is there a moral obligation to look globally and to realize that we need there to be global vaccination access and that the inequity we're already seeing is unjust, but also that it's actually not in anyone's national interest to just vaccinate their own population. We know this. It is in everyone's interest for everyone to be vaccinated. And so I'm hopeful that, as this narrative and questions arise about vaccine nationalism, that we'll be able to move beyond it. There are a number of advocacy campaigns, and I think the TRIPS waiver is a piece of it, that are at least bringing this question into the public eye. And I think that's a start. We have a long way to go, but the people are asking the question, is this the right thing to just be vaccinating, our populations when people move and there are borders and we're seeing massive surges in different parts around the world. And again, some countries have not received the vaccine yet at all. Although my understanding is that COVAX has delivered more than 38 million doses across 6 continents, and that there's been more than 100 economies. So I assume sort of nations reached, and then 61 are low income. So there's a start, but let's build on that aggressively and realize that it's in both national interest and the right thing to do for there to be a concerted, coordinated global effort.
So Rebecca, as you were speaking, I was looking at one of the attendees' questions concerning Chinese and Russian vaccines. Are those being made available to low-income countries, and are they? Do we know if they are equivalent to where we're at? I'd love to hear from your standpoint there in Washington, and then perhaps to ask the same question of some others.
Yes, they have been made available to various countries. I think there's a robust vaccine diplomacy effort. So sometimes the vaccines are given to low-income countries, and sometimes they're given to partners and neighbors. I think there's the question of just when the WHO and COVAX will approve those vaccines to be distributed through the program globally. And then I think that will be interesting to see. We'll have more vaccines available with different distribution and production capacities in places.
Anyone want to add to that at all? Otherwise, Bishop Michael, you mentioned the Give the World a Shot campaign in the UK. And Archbishop Linder, you mentioned a similar effort in Canada. If you get a vaccine, pay it forward. One more time to you, Rebecca, before I open up to everybody else. Do we see a similar program in the US right now?
I don't think there's the same kind of individual contribution piece of it. I hope that we'll be able to, but there's certainly been commitments, and I saw a question about this as well, from the US government. So the Biden administration just pledged an additional $4 billion to help countries access the COVID-19 vaccines. The American Rescue Plan, so the large COVID relief bill that just recently passed, included $11 billion in funding for global COVID-19 response. And then the bill that passed in December, while President Trump was still president, also had $4 billion for global vaccine access, including Gavi and including other kind of global health priorities. So there's been a US government commitment. And then again, there's a number of advocacy campaigns where people can get involved and urge the Biden administration to take certain policy actions.
Thank you for that. Archbishop Thabo, you had mentioned early on about the other bishops. You are primate of the province of Southern Africa, not simply South Africa. And there are many other nations that are a part of that, very similar to our own Episcopal Church in that way. Could you say something about how they're doing? You kind of alluded to this at the very start, but one of our listeners was wanting to see if there was more you could say about how the other, what you're hearing from some of the other countries, both within your province, but also perhaps on the continent.
Thank you, Chuck. From our province, and then I'll go to the others, it was a wake-up call and quite painful to lose a bishop due to COVID complications, the Bishop of Swaziland. And so COVID-19 or complications of coronavirus are real. And I haven't checked with my colleague just across our border if I could mention his name, but he's been up and down in terms of COVID-related illnesses. And during the second phase of the coronavirus in South Africa, I had some stage 5 bishops that were quite sickly, and it was just really getting worrying. And I also look at the contributions that are being made in Kenya. I read there Archbishop Jackson, and how from time to time children are, as Michael said, barred from going to school because a lot of our politicians are opting to lock down rather than really looking as the continent how we could push for trips and how we could push for licenses and how we could push for patents so that Africa herself could start really producing its own vaccines. If you look at the quantum of dollars that leave the continent to import drugs, I mean, we could build clinics and pharmaceutical companies. So something is lacking. And maybe I go back to one of the head of state that died recently in going up north. He was on record to say, I will not allow my people to take vaccines. Well, it was in the public media in Tanzania. And sadly, I'm not saying the good Lord was very worried about that reckless statement, but he died. So it is tough, except, well, maybe Egypt and one will say, and Algeria. The rest of the continent, even with COVAX, and I need to say quite loud here, COVAX is not working. COVAX is a wonderful idea, but the trickle is not good enough. We will not attain the population immunity at the rate of COVAX. We need to do much more than the agreement of COVAX. That's why I'm excited about today, because I know that Archbishop Linder will go and push somewhere, Michael will go push somewhere, Rebecca will go and push somewhere, and maybe we need a faith-related COVAX agreement that identify things like what are some of the doables in terms of our own advocacy on trips? What are some of our doables in terms of our own advocacy on licensing and sharing the know-how? Sorry, it was in a roundabout way, Chuck.
No. Very, very helpful, very important at the end. Let me make note of a couple of things in response to that. One is that the Archbishop of Canterbury, we're very pleased the Archbishop of Canterbury a few months ago began a fund called the Together in Unity Fund, which was specifically created to help with COVID relief throughout the communion. Several of our own bishops, I was in touch with several of our bishops in the Episcopal Church and dioceses that were able to contribute to that. And so we're very grateful for that. We're also very grateful for the Anglican Alliance, which is the organization, the network of which Episcopal Relief and Development and similar relief and developments, certainly for Canada, the PF. I always miss the acronym. Archbishop Linder, the Primates. What is it? Archbishop Linder, what is that?
Primates World Relief and Development Fund, PWRDF.
That's it.
Canadian Anglican Aid Agency.
Along with Episcopal Relief Development, along with many other relief and development agencies throughout the communion, the Anglican Alliance is kind of an umbrella organization, umbrella network. I'm pleased that in the chat room, Elizabeth Perry just shared part one of a publication from the Anglican Alliance, this one on vaccine hesitancy, and she gives the link to it, and part two on misinformation will be published tomorrow. I'm also grateful that Rebecca, that you shared with our attendees the Office of Government Relations Vaccine Toolkit, which has been on our episcopalchurch.org website for some time, and you give the very specific link to it. Again, it's a fantastic toolkit with many different things. And also thank you, Rebecca, in the chat room for calling on folks, letting folks know about the Episcopal Church signing on to an important letter calling for the TRIPS waiver. There are ways in which we can make a difference. Before we end this time, I want to address two different people raised the question of how can we pay it forward? Is there a place to literally donate? And so I'd love to hear from any of you all who know of a best answer. Bishop Michael, you put your hand up. Please go for it.
Okay, folks, if you've got pens and papers at the ready, it's www.vaccinate.org, VACCINAID. I'm afraid it has to take money in pounds sterling, but it's all welcome, and it goes to the COVAX fund to push that out as much as we can.
Archbishop Linder?
As I said before, pwrdf.org supports partners on the ground with COVID-related infrastructure and support. The project that I mentioned, lovemyneighborproject.org, is the combination of Millennium Kids and UNICEF raising funds for the delivery of COVAX vaccinations in places that could not afford that infrastructure around it. I would say check out any local development agency in the country that you're in and ask what they're doing around COVID vaccination, because it's much easier within your own country to contribute, and I'm sure there are organizations doing that.
Wonderful, and I see that. Thank you, Alan, who put down the PWRDF, of course, and of course for us thinking about our own ways through the Anglican Alliance, through Episcopal Relief and Development. Rebecca, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I would say there's so many organizations, and thank you for highlighting those that are able, that would benefit from donations. And I would also urge people to be engaged in advocacy to local governments, to our national government, depending on where you are, and really push for this being a global priority for all governments everywhere to coordinate and collaborate. I think advocacy is a hugely important piece of it, and public perception and public engagement creates political will for things. So that means we need to show that we care for there to be the political will generated to be able to make a difference. So I would urge everyone to be involved. There's lots of opportunities. If you're US based, join the Episcopal Public Policy Network. We're doing a lot on this, but there's many more opportunities.
Well, I want to say thank you to our panelists as we wrap up here. We're at the hour. We try to hit as many questions as possible. Let me ask here as a lightning round end, 30 seconds each. What is something you want to leave our listeners, our attendees with? 30 seconds each. 30 seconds. I'm going to pull the stage thing off. Let me start with you, Archbishop Thabo. Final last words. 30 seconds. Oh, no, you're unmute, please.
Okay, I think my final last word is please let's join hands and end this vaccine apartheid and nationalism. We can do it, we have done it in the past.
Amen. Archbishop Linder.
Let's love our neighbor as ourselves and take it at all fronts: advocacy and awareness, fundraising, pressuring government, and education and awareness every chance we get.
Amen. Bishop Michael.
The G7 summit is meeting in England in June, down in Cornwall. Please lobby your national government, if you're one of the G7 countries, to say we need a global solution for universal access to vaccination for all adults.
Amen. Rebecca.
Just a plea to echo my fellow panelists that this is a global crisis. It needs a global solution, and that will happen if we as citizens advocate, fundraise, and are committed to the well-being of everyone, that in turn also affects our own families and communities.
Well, what a wonderful place to end with those words. I am so deeply grateful to you all, our four distinguished panelists, and for your leadership in your various areas. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Office of Government Relations for hosting this important conversation on vaccination equitability. And of course, thanks to all of you who chose to make time to join us for this. So thanks to all our attendees. May God bless us all and encourage us indeed to make a difference together. Thank you.
And thanks, Chuck.
Yes, thank you, Chuck.